And and I think it's true to say that the media is a target, a military target now. Many journalists don't realise this, many producers and even newspaper editors aren't necessarily sure, but it's a covert target. There's black operations taking place against journalists. As we saw at this year's Bilderberg meeting, for anyone that was following it, the journalists are arrested, harassed and harried under the guise of security, but actually it's because they don't want any information whatsoever to get out about this conference. So and I'll be talking a bit more about Bilderberg later on. So this, what we have on the screen here, is a very, very important operation of NATO, which has been one of the most secret, at the time it was said it was the most secret thing. So there we have two NATO people blowing up some innocent people. And this was going on in the 70s and the 80s, mainly in Europe. NATO intelligence, based in Brussels at NATO headquarters, were organising fascists to go and blow up ordinary people across Europe and blame it on the extreme left. Now, this was because they wanted everyone to be afraid of the Soviet Union. And this was happening in Italy particularly, but also in Belgium and other places like that. So there we go. This is a chap who was in charge of SS Panzer Corps in the Second World War, Paul Hauser, and he's actually quoted as saying that NATO was formed from the international brigades of the SS. And there's more information come to light in the Daily Mail about this recently, from the Second World War. So what I think is what we're seeing now is a kind of covert Nazism resurfacing. This is their sort of modus operandi of this kind of, what I like to call a Nazi mafia. So what we have here is a private military companies. Now look at Iraq. Isn't it wonderful? The news is saying the troops have all come back, but what's actually happening on the ground is that it's mostly private military companies that are now running the security. And of course, the soldiers who've left the army and are now working for private military security and mercenaries get paid far, far more than they did as soldiers. So it's really a kind of a lie to say that, you know, there's none of our soldiers out in Iraq still. So we have things like fake political accidents, fake political suicides, false flag terror, which is where the blame is pinned on a different country or a different faction, and a Gulf of Tonkin style incident, which is an attack on your own actual forces, like an aircraft or a naval ship. So these are the kinds of modus operandi we're seeing from this faction. Yeah, so the other thing about Gladio is if you haven't seen this series, get hold of a copy of it, have a watch of it. The producer that made it, Alan Frankovich, died in mysterious circumstances going over to interview an ex-head of the CIA at Houston Airport. He went into the customs and never came out again. Alan Frankovich was working for BBC Two Time Watch series. And this is really was really difficult to actually get hold of a copy of this, but it exposes this whole NATO killing European civilians program. Here's just one example. Bologna railway station blown to pieces, 80-something people killed in 1990. And this happened also in Northern Ireland, Force Research Unit, where the British Army was colluding with loyalist terrorists, supplying them with bombs and this sort of thing. So Northern Ireland is a little bit closer to home. This is Brigadier Gordon Kerr. Now, apparently he was working out in Iraq, so I'm not quite sure where he is now, but the Stevens report into the collusion in Northern Ireland fingered Gordon Kerr. So, I mean, if I was Gordon Kerr wandering around the streets of Britain now, I would wonder if I was going to have my collar felt, because he was shown to have been a key person in feeding explosives to loyalist terrorists. So this is another aspect of all this, is we've got this kind of religious war going on, an attempt to get these various factions fighting each other. Particularly, I have to say at the moment, you can see it's the Judaism and Islam is at loggerheads. This is Temple Mount. This is definitely a place to watch for the future, because what we've got here is a complete clash of ideologies, religious ideologies. This is the place in Jerusalem where the old temple was, the old Jewish temple, Solomon's temple, and what's happened is there's now a Muslim mosque, the second most holy mosque, I believe, in Islam, on the same site, and there's constant clashes. The certain factions amongst the Jews want to get rid of this mosque and build their temple, and obviously that's going to cause all sorts of mayhem. Even when there's an attempt to build the cornerstone of the temple, you'll find there's clashes in Jerusalem. Obviously, Jerusalem is a city to watch, but this is a particularly interesting and rather worrying spot. So I also come from a sort of pretty much traditional Christian point of view, in that I think a lot of these things are there in prophecy, particularly in Daniel and the book of Revelation. And I've got a little handout for anyone that's interested afterwards. I've done an analysis of Revelation, looking at some of the things which are there's something like 22, 23 different events that Revelation prophesies for the final clash of civilizations. Anyway, the context really, we move on to talking about the media. Now, how many people here, I'll just do a little quick survey, think the media is controlled? Most people, right, okay. Well, I have to disagree with you, actually, because last week, I mean, is it just this week? No, last week, there's some amazing revelations came out in The Guardian about this MP's expenses scandal. They have done some really good investigative journalism, which I don't think anybody here has the resources to do, and that is to find out exactly what happened to this leak. For example, I'll be talking about this a little bit later, but the media is a major battleground. It's not controlled. It's a place where everybody's fighting for control still. And also, you'll see on Channel 4 News and Newsnight and places like that, you will often find very important bits of investigative journalism coming out still. So I think we must be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. There's also lots of beleaguered journalists who are losing spirit, and they need to be sort of bigged up and be told, just keep on keeping on, guys. And if you can't work as a staff journalist, work as a freelance journalist and get your stuff out elsewhere. But you have to remember that the journalists do not control the transmitters, the journalists do not control the printing presses. It's other people like the Barclay brothers, who own the Daily Telegraph, that control that printing press. And it's very, very difficult for journalists sometimes to get stories out. And they will tell you there are all sorts of areas that can be career suicide. The BBC is something I wanted to talk about a little bit now, because that's quite well documented what happened to that. Now, I don't know if anybody noticed, but something's happened to the BBC in the last 30 years. I'm sure you have noticed. There's this new kind of person on the Board of Governors, which is now the Trust. Pauline Neville-Jones is from Kinetic, which is a private military company. It's the privatised version of what used to be DERA, Defence Evaluation Research Establishment. So we see now a very different type of BBC. I think there's something unsatisfying about it, watching the BBC these days and listening to it. It's like a low-calorie meal or something. Having said that, there are some really good, I don't know if anyone here saw the Red Riding series, there's still some good stuff going on. So just remember, it's not controlled, it's a battleground, and people are fighting to get good drama and good journalism out there still. They haven't given up yet. Now, this is really when the BBC had its biggest problem, right, which was 1986. This guy was Director General. He was Alistair Milne, and he was a producer and writer on the Old Tonight programme, which was around before Newsnight, I believe. I think I was too young, really, to be able to stay up and watch Tonight. But he also worked on That Was the Week That Was, and other programmes. But then he worked his way up through the management to become Director General. His son is Seamus Milne, who was, until recently, I looked at The Guardian recently, he's not anymore, but he was comments editor at The Guardian. And in 1986, Alistair Milne was sacked over several programmes that he'd approved. And one of them was called Maggie's Militant Tendency. This was a BBC, I think, Panorama documentary, which at the time there was all this talk about Labour left militant. I don't know if you remember that, the militant tendency, but this programme was all about Maggie's militant tendency, and it showed the far right of the Tory party. Remember, this is during a Thatcher government, and she went absolutely livid that they were showing that there were fascists in the Tory party. And this was good old independent BBC Panorama having a go. There was also another series called Secret Society by Duncan Campbell. He was an investigative journalist, not to be confused with the guy who's the crime writer in The Guardian, writing about American military power in Britain. And Duncan Campbell's series, Secret Society, is one of the most riveting documentary programmes I've ever seen. It had all sorts of little things to do with top secret stuff, including the Zircon spy satellite, the fact that the 500 million pounds of public money had been secretly spent on this spy satellite, that it didn't look like it was ever going to work. He had a program all about that. He also had one on emergency planning, that is to say, if there's a national emergency, what would happen? And it turns out that all us would be co-opted to work for these kind of American organisations. This is all back in 1986. And there was also a very good program on secret cabinet committees. These cabinet committees which go off and research, shall we buy the Trident missile system? And they come back to the cabinet and say, basically, yes, we must. But anyway, these are secret committees, and often there's a majority of people who aren't even in the cabinet on that